we are going to begin on our moonlit forest in the sky where the moon is going to be placed. And a lot of light's going to be emanating from this area, so I began by applying a little bit of titanium white to the center there, and now I'm taking a mixture of primary blue, a little bit of white, and a little bit of black, and surrounding it. I'm using a round-headed brush, and I'm doing this because it can hold a lot of paint, it can move a lot of paint, and because it doesn't have any sharp edges, it doesn't create as much of a streaky aesthetic. So with that in mind, I'm now placing a little bit more black along the outskirts, and it isn't a pure black. As you can see, I'm mixing in more blue and white with it. I'm just trying to create a very subtle gradient coming from that very lit middle center area. So now I'm really just blending all of it outwards, ensuring that I have a decent gradient. And when you do that, you can kind of render a streaky aesthetic. However, if you don't have too much paint on the canvas and if it started to dry just a little bit, you end up with a much better application. So keep that in mind when you're doing that sort of thing. From there, I'm going in and I'm applying even more of a dark pigment to the edges. And again, it isn't a pure black. Pure black, it's very easy to apply, but if you mix in just a little bit of blue or any other color, you'll get so much more depth and interest within the pigment itself. So from there, I'm grabbing a medium-sized square-headed brush, and I'm beginning to draw on a little moon. I'm using the square-headed brush because it has sharp edges and it can render nice little detailed lines around the outskirts of our moon. So I also used a plain titanium white, however, because the background is still wet, it blended to a point. We will go back on and reapply more white, but I'm going to let it dry so that I don't create something too muddy. So with that being said, I'm now grabbing a very old square-headed brush. All of the bristles kind of leaf out in varying directions. And with a green, I'm dabbing on just a litany of foliage and the tops of trees, right? So this green's a mixture of a gray, so a black, a white, and also a lot of yellow and a little bit of blue. You can mix a fairly nice green using yellow and blue. However, blue's generally a lot stronger, so you'll need to mix in more yellow than blue in that mix itself. I'm using the brand Basic, just in case anyone is curious. All of the materials are always listed in the description box as well. So with all of that being said, here I'm taking more pigment. It's a little bit of a darker pigment, and I'm just applying more foliage. Again, it's all in a tapping motion. I'm using it in a tapping motion as opposed to a brush stroke motion, because all of these little dots and details are going to imply leaves and foliage in the distance. When you get really far away, you can't make out the details in all of these little things. And just a tapping effect will make it look so much more real and authentic. So I'm not done with the moon and I'm not done with the trees, but I do need to let those areas dry to apply more pigment on them, to add highlights, to add shadows. And while I let that dry, I'm going to go down to this river here that's going to be wrapping around all of our trees. It's also going to have a really beautiful reflection from the moon. So I'm taking that same primary blue that I used in the sky, however I'm mixing it with a lot more white. And as you can see, I'm also using the same square-headed brush that I used for the moon. I also did all of that with horizontal strokes, and that was just to imply a little bit of movement in the water. So now I'm just kind of figuring out where I want the rest of my bushes and foliage and grass and all of that to be. And so I'm doing that again with the very old square-headed brush. I'm using more of that very dark green mixture, and I'm applying it yet again in this tapping motion. I'm slightly moving over portions of the water, as you can see, and that's really just going to help instill depth, right? Because it's going to look like you can see through these bushes that are in the foreground, and right behind them is that water. So you really want that blue kind of overlapping in between all of these little pieces of foliage and whatnot. When I'm doing that tapping motion, by the way, I'm also rotating my brush in the air slightly. So every time I go for a tap, it's going to look slightly different than the one beside it. And this random aesthetic is going to make it look so much more natural and real. So from there, I'm just grabbing a lighter green here, and I'm applying that to the edges of my bushes and my trees. I'm doing it with the same application, just still with a tapping motion. And because the background is still a little bit wet, it's blending to a point, but that's completely okay because I know I can go back in later and add additional highlights again. So here again, I'm just trying to add the light that is reflecting off the moon and off the water onto the edges and the less dense areas of our trees and foliage. Now again, while I let that dry, I'm moving back down into the water in horizontal strokes and applying just more of that, getting much more of a finished coverage, right? So a lot of this painting is done in stages. We have to remember that, you don't always finish every piece of the painting immediately. Sometimes you do have to let it dry. And, there's so many other things to do while it does dry. There's so many pieces and portions to the painting. So don't get discouraged and don't get frustrated trying to rework something over and over and over. You can take a break. You can go and work on something else, and it's completely okay. So with all of that being said, I'm now taking a very small square-headed brush, a bit of burnt umber, a little bit of titanium white, and a little bit of black, and I'm applying a number of trees. Now, the trees in the foreground are a little bit larger, the trees in the background are a little bit smaller, and as you can see, they're all moving in slightly different directions. There's one that's kind of falling over on the far right, and I'm trying to ensure that they have a little bit of a swivel, a little bit of a movement in there, because these trees are growing and being pushed up against one another. There's wind and a number of factors that are changing them. If you really want your painting to look interesting and realistic, ensure to incorporate a lot of diversity amongst your trees, both in the foliage and in the trunks as well. And that's really going to help aid your painting. So from there, I've let the darker areas of the tree dry fairly well, and now I'm going in with an even brighter green, and again applying a highlight to the edges. These are all of the areas that the moonlight is going to be cast upon and hitting. We're still leaving a lot of dark areas in the trees, and that's what's going to make it look voluminous. That's what's going to make it look very real. You want light areas, you want darker areas, you want areas that have a middle tone, and that's why we started with a very dark base, and then we added a medium tone, and now we're adding a highlight. They all add up, and you can kind of see through them to a point as well. As you can see, even in the very bright areas, you can still see areas around them that are darker, and that just helps remind the eye that, there are multiple layers, there are multiple levels to all of our foliage. So we actually finished this one a little bit early here, but I thought I'd just show you here. Just very quickly, I'm tapping in additional highlights to show you, you can always go back, you can add more, and acrylic paint generally dries much more transparently than oils. And so for that reason, sometimes you'll apply a highlight and you look back at it later and you're like, that's not that bright. And you're right, it actually isn't. It dried a little bit darker, so you have to go back and re-add on that highlight. But anyways, there we have it, our finished painting. I ended up going back again, like I said, because the highlights just weren't as bright as I wanted. So I went back, I added a couple minutes, I fixed it. We always cheat with this series, but I really hope you enjoyed. I hope you go out and you create something very similar. I hope you have a lot of fun. And if you enjoyed this and you want to see more, I post these 10-minute painting challenge tutorials, whatever they may be, every Saturday. So I hope to see you next Saturday. And above all, stay creative.